Today we are going to be looking at women in the 1950s. The 1950s was this period that was mixed with the end of World War II and the increase in not only consumption because of better economics, but because of an increase in economics, a focus on consumption and consumerism that was tied directly to Cold War anxieties as well. So there's a lot going on in how the 1950s was developed, reactions to conservatism as well, all that were based on basically the end of World War II and the Cold War and the tensions that the Soviet Union and the United States, along with, of course, the idea of communism versus capitalism played. So I want to look at a little bit of the background first. And how we get to the characteristics and structures of what became the suburban housewife as the ideal role for women in the 1950s, which really dominated so much of society in popular culture. So first, looking at after World War II and what was going on there that shaped a lot of this for women. The first thing was that new affluence, which I was mentioning with the wealth and the increase in both wealth and jobs. And you had this increase in wealth and jobs because of World War II. What it had done, right, is that we were a lender nation during World War II, which then brought in, money after the war for those that were repaying. You also had increased production, which we saw with the war industry and stuff during World War II, and that led to more jobs, along with, of course, because of the wealth, right, that also led to more jobs. This is important because what it does is it was seen as creating stability and prosperity. And this is going to be an important theme to combat the anxiety of the Cold War era. Now, you also have the GI Bill that took place after World War II, and that was introduced to, it was for male soldiers. Of course, who it largely targeted was white male soldiers. And this directly benefited mostly the white middle class family. And we'll see that that is the target group of which the suburban housewife is targeted within society, because ultimately, the white middle class family with a suburban housewife, one, you have to be able to afford a suburban home, and then also the idea that you make enough money and are economically stable enough to have your wife not have to work. So of course this ends up eliminating lower class families, any kind of minority family for the most part as well, and that was definitely reinforced within the media, and we'll look at that. The GI Bill, then, who it didn't benefit is largely black soldiers. Male soldiers were excluded from pretty much all of the benefits, which will be one of the things that ends up pushing towards the civil rights movement, where you have not only a lack of benefits, but a lack of recognition for black soldiers and what they did in World War II. Both of these things then helps. It's not the only thing. The civil rights movement was complicated in what took place to push that movement forward, but it definitely was one of the impacts, is that it led to many feeling like that they were, continuing to not only be disenfranchised, but ignored, excluded from the prosperity of the 1950s. and obviously not appreciated in the process. And it was just one more reason to push back for better rights and for equal rights. Then the new affluence also then, of course, had a focus on consumption. And consumption meaning purchasing power, right? Buying things. There was a huge aspect of the power of the consumer, and specifically the power of the consumer to fight against communism, right? Because capitalism was the antithesis of communism. And so you have this strong push towards anything capitalist. And the idea of and where they're going to emphasize it with women, of course, is that in the suburban housewife, there should be her goal of buying stuff for the house. And that buying stuff for the house, buying stuff in general, right? That this all is this is combating communism. It's also reestablishing normalcy, and the idea of how Americans should live the ideal type of life. And then because of the GI Bill and programs to give loans to soldiers and, white soldiers and first-time homeowners, along with the increase in affluence, you have the move to the suburbs. And with the move to the suburbs, this is where then you get that development of suburban life. Now, this was not entirely new. You have suburbs that existed by the 1920s. That was that really beginning a period of creating the manufactured homes. But it was still in its infancy back then. Yeah, you had the cars that were starting, but that's one of the key components that's necessary of suburbs is transportation. And you have that boom beginning in the 1920s, but the mass production of cars and the accessibility of cars and everyone having cars by the 1950s allowed people to move out of the city into the suburbs, and then they may work in the city, but they can travel into the city to do so, because of course you don't have the public transportation. That's still to this day the same way that it works, is the suburbs don't have the public transportation that the cities do. So you have to have a car to be able to get around outside of the suburbs. The suburbs is more of a living place. And a lot of them now have like stores and other things nearby, but there's still suburbs today that are essentially just housing spheres, if you will. And there's almost no shops, and you have to go outside of that suburb to be able to shop, to work, to do anything. And that's what you saw a lot with the 1950s, is that they really were these kind of separate sectors. So you had to have some kind of transportation to make that work. And then we said the home loans, to encourage especially white families to move. And there were rules in some of the suburbs that specifically barred Black families from living in those suburbs. And this then moved us to leave the city. And then it was reinforced as a place that you could raise the family and was safe. And that one is definitely, again, a reaction to fears of the Cold War and looking for creating a secure and stable aspect. So that's what the new affluence and what's going on. We're going to look at a little bit more at the consumption, consumerism, when we talk about the suburban housewife specifically. The other part of the 1950s that was very prevalent as the Cold War was going on was the Cold War anxieties, right? And the Cold War it was larger than that. The main two players, right, were between the United States and the Soviet Union. However, of course, other groups played roles in that as spheres of influence, and those groups that the United States felt that they needed to intervene, we'll say intervention, into communist states by the United States, right? So it was not just the Soviet Union, the United States, but the huge two power players of the Cold War were the United States and the Soviet Unions. And certainly from a United States perspective at the time, those were the two players. It was very self-centered look at how they identified with it, but it really was that the United States saw themselves as the center of all this, and the Soviet Union as the big bad evil, and then their spheres of influences who were corrupted by the Soviet Union, and it was the United States' responsibility and job to promote capitalism and try to stop the spread of communism, right? So we put that one, that the United States had a responsibility, and that's really how they saw it, to stop the spread of communism and the influence of the Soviet Union. And they really did see that any spread of communism, any nation that was communist or looking maybe leaning that way, the United States at this time saw it very in black and white in the idea that everything had to have the hand of the Soviet Union. So no one would want to be communist unless the Soviet Union was pushing it. And that capitalism was the true way to go. And then, of course, you had, besides that dichotomy between the United States and the Soviet Union, you had the fear of atomic bombs. This was discussed, and we saw, that was actually brought up before they dropped the bombs, the scientists and others that said that there's going to create a domino effect of other societies and nations having atomic weapons, and the danger that puts on people. And it was a true, full fear of the Soviet Union launching atomic bombs on the United States. And what they would do, it was perpetuated within this culture with drills in schools and TV ads, where what they would do is in school, you would have atomic bomb drills. And these were where you would hide under your desk. Drop, hide, tuck, and hide. Drop and tuck and hide. Of course, hiding under your desk wasn't going to stop an atomic bomb if it was close, but there was nothing. I mean, you were powerless, and that's the idea with this, is right, that this is where a lot of this fear was, is that they were powerless to really do anything, and so they created this sense of anxiety and fear even within kids, of constantly putting these ads talking about the destruction and annihilation, and that the Soviet Union at any point could be trying to destroy the United States in the way of living. And so you have, with that anxiety, right, this constant distrust of the Soviet Union, which of course went all the way back with the Nazi, the non-aggression pact with the Nazis, the Soviet Union. So we can put that as one part of it, right? The non-aggression pact was probably that starting distrust, and then of course because of Stalin and expansion, and then this idea that communism was a direct threat to the American way of life. So the communists, they were out to get you. They were looking to destroy the American ideal and the way of life, the values of America. And so you always needed to be vigilant of that. And so it did create this fear and instability of just daily life. And so there was an attempt because of that to instill, we'll say, American values of what they're going to define as that, as a way to fight communism. And what this meant by American values in those terms was the idea of a return to traditional norms. Okay, and traditional norms in this sense was looking at the nuclear family. Let's put that here. And even the right, the idea of the nuclear family, that connection and that name to the atomic bombs. That the nuclear families are stabilizers. Families create security. It's also gender roles. There is a huge emphasis on proper gender roles and the idea of conformity to these, both political and social. You don't challenge, the political and social norms of the United States because that thing could help the communists win. Gender roles were extremely important because they helped reinforce the nuclear family, all of which then fought against, along with buying stuff, against communism. Right, so that's where you go. Now, with that, then you have, let's see, the Suburban Housewife. We'll do that as its separate thing here. And this was part of the family, right? And the nuclear family and the importance of gender roles. The Suburban Housewife then became the central theme of combating and preventing communism. And why? So that was one of the reasons. The other thing, of course, was this idea of going back to traditional norms. And what it meant by going back to traditional norms was an acknowledgement of the role that women played in the war industry and military in World War II. Right? And so you had all these women working in the factory jobs, and many who were interested in staying working after the war. And so there was a push, this idea that you needed to push or encourage women to go back to the home. Right? They needed women to be housewives. They needed women to want to have children and have a family, because again, that combats communism and the anxieties with that. And so what ends up happening is the role of media is going to play a really, really important, even more so than what we saw in the 1920s, even more so than the propaganda posters in World War I. The role of media plays a massive role in shaping this idea of the ideal woman, which was the suburban housewife. Right? And it's so women end up getting inundated with this ideal perspective, how women are supposed to behave, how women are supposed to act, what a suburban housewife looks like. And you see that with TV shows. You're going to see it in magazines. For example, a good show highlight of this with magazines has to do with a Life magazine. So in Life magazine, there was, in the 1950s, right? I should probably put 1950s, 1960s, because there's a 1950s culture that goes into the 1960s, by the way. But in Life magazine, you have an article that was called The American Woman, which was from 1956. All right, so that was the title, 1956 episode or article. And this is the description. And so this woman was showcased as the ideal, the quintessential American woman in 1956. She was 32 and a mother of 4. Right. One of the misconceptions that's interesting is that I think people think, women in the 1950s, suburban housewife, they wanted 2 kids. No, they most wanted 4. 4 was that magic number that way. She was a high school graduate, and who married her high school sweetheart. So one of the things right here that they don't emphasize is college education, which many women were actually going to college and getting a college degree before getting married. So married her high school sweetheart. They describe her in this article as pretty and popular. She's described as a hostess and a volunteer. She's the home manager. This is definitely that key idea with that suburban housewife. I mean, all of this fits into that portrait. But one of the things that definitely gets emphasized is that being as a suburban housewife, right? Your role is the home manager. Besides that, she supported her husband. That's definitely one of those things we'll see. This idea of being submissive and supportive to your husband. Your identity is not your own. She did all the shopping for food. I mean, this is what the article is highlighting. Takes care of the kids, which of course is expected, and focused on the kids. Right. And so this is just a magazine. This is the portrait then that they're focusing on in that women are reading about. And one of the key aspects with a lot of this is this domestic ideology. Okay. And this idea, part of it in the domestic ideology was, again, as we mentioned, the belief that consumption, right, because it's capitalism, the purchasing, fights communism. But it also was an attempt to, or a reaction to women working in World War II and trying to reassert the domestic sphere, which we've talked about before in class, that domestic sphere of importance. And what we said with the security and stability of traditional roles. But this goes further than just these general aspects of what did it mean for that. So it was promoting, and again, this is largely middle class because they're the ones that's connected to the suburbs. They're the ones that can afford it. But promoting domestic ideals. And so what that means is committed to the home, right? And working in the home, not going out and having a job, even though more women than ever before were actually still working in the 1950s. But you wouldn't ever know it by the media because the media was putting on this whole different perspective that you have a family right, that you have children, and that your main role is to take care of the house, right? Chores and things like that. So what you end up getting with this promoting and the house care was this idea that is in a lot of ads and stuff, that housework is fun. One of the ads was talking about how, look, mopping the floor, yay, so much fun. Another good example with cooking, shake and bake. They had all these ads. It's so easy, it's so fun. You shake it and then you bake it. Woo! Or I can get my floors mopped and sparkling clean. I enjoy mopping. And so they promoted this idea that women just had a blast doing housework. And then that women's identity, the suburban housewife, your identity was structured around the house, and specifically housework, really, more than just the house itself. And then so we see this in with mass consumption and what's being produced with this, and in part that's because you do have new technology during this period, with appliances, decorations, toys, and money that then they can do that, and the idea that women are the ones buying this stuff, women purchasing this stuff. But to give you an idea of how much women's identity would end up getting shaped by this domestic ideology, and it's effective. It was super effective. There was a Gallup poll in 1961, and what it asked was, they asked women, what are your goals? That's it. No specifics in what are your goals as a housewife, what are your goals in life, what are your goals, whatever. Just what are your goals? And here are the top things. So the very number one was 4 children, as I mentioned, right? Not 2 children and a white picket fence, not children's, 4 children. Number 2, the second one was built-in ovens. You gotta get those built-in ovens. Number 3 was Formica countertops. Marble countertops come later as a goal. The 4th is finished woodwork in the house. And then the 5th was a 4-bedroom house. So take a minute to look at this, right? This list here. They asked these women, the Gallup poll did a huge poll in 1961, and so what's the benefit of 1961 is it shows that in the 1950s there's been some time for the media to promote this domestic sphere. And so they asked women, just what are your goals? That's it. What are your goals? And every single one except for the first one, which was children, are items. It's not personal goals. No personal goals besides maybe the having children. Okay, so we could say the having children. Okay. Outside of that, all of the other ones are wrapped. What it does is it suggests that a woman's identity is based on domestic goods and products for the house. The idea of your goals in life, what makes you happy, is stuff, right? Stuff specifically in the realm of the domestic sphere should be your life goals, can make you happy and content. This should be your goal in life, is to have these things for the house. And so what I want to look at is advertisements, and how this promoted that. So we're going to look, I had those out for you in the PDF. of the advertisements in the 1950s, and what are some of the characteristics. And one of the things that I'm going to put first are going to be those household products. Right? Household products, serving or submissive to husband, right? And the identity of a woman, happiness through domestic sphere. Okay, we'll put a few more after we look at this, but those are definitely key ones from that, and definitely this idea too of the mother, but women being submissive to their husband, passive roles, that type of thing. Okay, so let's take a look. And this will be a common theme. I'll add that one after. It's women aren't very intelligent. So one of the things we see is that women are not very smart. You see this in TV, you see this in ads. It's pervasive during this period, which is ironic because more women than ever are graduating with college degrees, and yet you're getting this reinforcement that women aren't smart, they can't go out and work, their role is within the household and everything else is So here, what you mean a woman can open it? And that's definitely the inferior to men. In a lot of these advertisements in TV, it's that men are better. Men are superior and women are this annoying thing that men have to deal with. So you mean a woman can open it, and it's advertising for ketchup, the new ketchup bottle. Here, the Suburban Housewife, home cleaning hints. This was also in books, right? This one wasn't an ad, but books and magazines, as I mentioned, did this huge emphasis on ways to make cleaning the house fun. And one of the things we're going to see also with this is, like, look how she's dressed. In heels and a nice dress for cleaning. You had to look nice while cleaning. And that's going to be an emphasis too, is how women look. Women are supposed to present themselves in a specific way. We're going to see this in the list for what a good wife was supposed to be as well. So here, the ideal present for the suburban housewife. Christmas morning, she'll be happier with a Hoover. All right, so she's all looking lovingly at the vacuum. But this idea of, again, of consumption. A huge emphasis on purchasing household goods for women. Wives, look this ad over carefully. Circle the items you want for Christmas. Show it to your husband. If he does not go to the store immediately, cry a little. Not a lot, just a little. He'll go. Circle the quality appliances you want. And again, so here's all women want for presents are kitchen household appliances. Husbands, look this ad over carefully. Pick out what you want, your wife wants. Go buy it before she starts to cry. So again, this idea of, women, it's not about intelligence. It's about she'll cry if I don't get her these appliances. Here, so the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. Gosh, honey, you seem to thrive on cooking, cleaning, and dusting. And I'm all tuckered out by closing time. What's the answer? Vitamins. So this is an ad for vitamins, but it suggests that, women that your husband will be attracted to you if you are a good housewife. Will be attracted to you if you are a good housewife. And there were counter arguments to this, that if you nagged your husband too much or didn't do your job or didn't look pretty, again, look at the dress, right? Not just that she's wearing a dress, but the style of what they're wearing for cleaning. If you didn't look pretty and proper, that your husband would be more likely to cheat on you or divorce you and marry someone younger and prettier who followed that ideal suburban role. So there was almost this anxiety, and we're going to see that with the ads in a minute, anxiety about keeping your husband happy. As at any moment, if you disappointed your husband, right, he might divorce you. Okay, so next one. Married, no reason to neglect stockings. Constant runs are unsightly and expensive. Cut them down with Lux. Look at him looking all disappointing at her unseemly stockings. Husbands admire wives who keep their stockings perfect. Again, looks, so much on looks. Next, the chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for. This is the go-to women's place is in the kitchen. In fact, there was unfortunately, YouTube copyright stuff took this one down, but there was one, I think it was with Leave It to Beaver, and he's with his father and they're barbecuing. And he's like, Dad, why is it that men are having all these things for barbecuing, which he calls the asbestos gloves, which you're like, oh, there's a product that's not safe. And with what mom does, the cooking in the kitchen, and she doesn't have to do this. And he's, oh, this brings us back to hunting and gathering days, and the men hunted and for their food, and then it basically says, and women, they're meant to be in the kitchen. They don't come out and barbecue because that's not their space. Their sphere is in the kitchen. So again, reinforced in media all over the place. Here, I'm late, but dinner won't be. This one is actually interesting because this one is focusing on working women. Now, one of the things I want to point out with the 1950s is this dichotomy between this ideal suburban housewife, but still sometimes acknowledging that there were plenty of women who did work, and that there were women who were working and then coming home. Well, now you could have a TV dinner because you didn't have time to make a full meal. They still are going to promote the suburban housewife as the ideal, but it is the expectation that if they were a working woman, you still were supposed to be the suburban housewife as much as you could. But there's acknowledging it, which is something. It's not all the time, but you do see it come in here and there. And there's going to be some acknowledgement of women with college education. And yet, again, there gets so many reinforced about women not being smart. And this one of the things we see a lot in 50s and 60s is violence against women. And you're going to see it in TV shows. You're going to see it in ads. If your husband ever finds out you're not store testing for fresher coffee, he's apparently going to beat you. If he discovers you're still taking chances on getting flat still coffee, woe be unto you. For today, there's a sure way certain way to test for freshness before you buy. So, violence against women during this period is hinted at or straight up shown. And again, contrast this to the 1920s and what we saw with ads empowering women in the 1920s, and how significant of a shift this has taken place by the 1950s, all in a part to reestablish and normalize traditional gender roles to combat communism. And it really was, one, again, because they needed to get women back in the household to open up those jobs that women had taken during the war industry for all the men coming back from war. But two, it really was truly believed that the suburban housewife, the nuclear family, the very clear-cut gender roles would fight against and defeat communism. And so this was constantly pushed, and again, in part because of anxiety and this belief that, that this normalization of these things would alleviate fears and anxiety of the uncertainty of the Cold War era. And to some, it did. But at the same time, it normalized stuff that wasn't normal gender roles before. We weren't seeing this. Maybe gender roles like in the 1800s, but there had been so much change in after the Civil War, for 1880s, 1920s, even the Great Depression. You have a little bit of pushback. One of the things you do see is that there's whenever there's a conservative movement, right, that goes on with that, you have a shift to more what's considered the traditional gender roles, which means women in the home. And so the Great Depression put that on, and then you have a reaction with the World War II to those more traditional roles as well. Now, again, this violence in this one, men are better than women. They just straight up say it. There's no hinting at this one. Look at how they're saying men are better than women. This is advertising sweaters, by the way. Sweaters, this is what this ad is for. Indoors, women are useful, even pleasant. Oh my gosh, and we need to talk about this word pleasant. Pleasant became the ideal word for descriptor for women. In fact, one of the women's magazines talked about a woman saying, "When I die, I want my headstone to read, 'She was pleasant.'" And that was the ideal. That's the epitome of what women should go for. Pleasant, as your descriptor. But the thing with pleasant is it lacks identity. That's when we're going to talk about the movie TV shows during the 1950s, and some of the women, I Love Lucy, Lucille Ball, and I Love Lucy was not that, and that one was going to be unique in some ways, and in other ways not. But a lot of the women in the TV shows in the 1950s that reinforced the ideal suburban housewife, pleasant was a good way to describe her. She didn't have a lot of identity, or personality. Because if you have too much personality, you're definitely not going to be described as pleasant. And so you see that word pleasant being used as that's what women should strive for. So she was pleasant, and basically it says, but taking them to the mountains is sometimes a drag, so don't go having them up a cliff just to show off your Drummond climbing sweaters. No need to. These pullovers look great anywhere. So right, they're talking, ignoring her, and she's hanging off a cliff almost dying, and they're saying, yeah, that's a drag to try to bring women up on the cliff, and you don't need to. You can wear your sweater anywhere. Here's another one with violence again. Whoop. Where, and this is for, these are for pants. That's why I was like, I think so. The legs, the pants. So it's nice to have a girl around the house. And she's like been an animal that's been shot and killed and skinned for a carpet. And he's stepping on her head. All right, so those are those. I want to show you the coffee ads. I put those up, but I want to go over those too, and then we'll talk about what we just looked at here with these. So these were the coffee ads. It's just coffee ads. There were other ads that were like this too. These are just the coffee ads. And then there are clips from each of these that showcase really well the ideal suburban housewife. And the anxieties that the suburban housewife had for pleasing your husband.
You make me feel very unwifely, Miss Naughton. Go barbecue.
I still say don't serve your awful coffee with my steaks.
Oh, Mrs. Olson, he's always crabbing about my coffee. I could cry.
Your coffee, sir.
Thanks, beautiful.
You're welcome.
How can such a pretty wife make such bad coffee?
I heard that.
Darling, it's our anniversary. Why so glum?
Nothing. Well, it's your coffee.
Again? Even today?
Honey, your coffee just doesn't taste any good.
This must have been such a nice vacation. Did you ever see Larry looking so happy?
Oh, honey, happiness is a vacation. Away from your coffee. Forget the coffee, Marge. It's never very good.
But still,
I'll get some at the plant.
Harold, is the coffee all right?
Mm-mm.
You mean it's as bad as yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
No improvement at all?
Mm-mm.
Harold, don't just shake your head. You've got to tell me what's wrong with the coffee.
Bad taste.
Attention, ladies, please. Right now, at the end of aisle 2, I've set out a brand new, can't-miss, husband-pleasing coffee.
Oh, no.
What's wrong?
Oh, it's your coffee again. The desk sergeant at the station makes better coffee than this.
Ed, really?
Sorry, honey. Your coffee tastes terrible.
Mrs. Olson. Mary, come in. My goodness. You look as if you lost your last friend.
It's my Jim again. You should have heard him this morning. Mary, your coffee is as undrinkable as ever.
Oh, and Jim's always so nice. I hope you and Tom are enjoying meeting all your new neighbors, Diane.
Oh, we are.
Oh, I'm so glad.
You made us feel so at home. Everything's wonderful.
Even the coffee's better. Here.
Wonderful anniversary, dear, and thank you for the flowers.
You're welcome, darling. But if you could do one thing for me,
What?
try to do something about your coffee.
I hoped it would be better today.
Harvey, want anything special for your birthday?
Just a decent cup of coffee.
You're kidding.
I'm serious. Honey, your coffee's undrinkable.
It's pretty harsh.
Well, so's your coffee. You know, the girls down at the office make better coffee on their hot plates. Well, see you later. Hey, this coffee is criminal.
Honey, you killed the petunias.
Then you admit it. Your coffee really is murder.
Papa adding my coffee. It's murder. It's either too bitter or too weak.
Try Folgers. Because Folgers coffee is mountain grown,
Mountain grown?
like the sign says. Mountain grown for richer flavor.
You know, it's a crime not to have delicious coffee like this all the time.
We will, now that I've discovered the mountains. Ooh.
Folgers coffee, mountain grown for richer flavor.
Okay, so what you get with this is that idea of that, right, they risk their husband not having affection for them or leaving them because of bad coffee, which is interesting in that sense of that, right, they're super anxious through all of those of that somehow their marriage is failing because they're making poor coffee. And then the women are then so concerned about pleasing their husbands and then have to go find how to make the right coffee. And then at the end, right, she gets affection from her husband again because she finally makes good coffee. But there's innuendos of like that the husband is displeased with his wife, and then I'll get coffee at the at work. And I don't know if it was in that one, but in one of them it was the secretary makes better coffee and I'll just get it from her. And then she's devastated, like that she's concerned her husband's going to leave her because she makes poor coffee. So you get this idea of what is femininity and the wife. And so you have definitely passive roles, right? They don't, occasionally you have someone stand up. We'll see with I Love Lucy, for example. She is sometimes passive, but way less passive than others. But in a lot of the media, it shows passive roles, that you're submissive to your husband, right? And we saw that in the advertisements as well. The idea of that, even as mothers, right? They're not authoritarian. That's left up to the father. So the mothers are just supposed to be loving, but you're not supposed to really be strict or have any of the rules. And it's clear that men have the physical authority over women, and that leads to where we see the even in I Love Lucy, a suggestion of violence or actual violence. And then the idea that within, I guess the passive roles, that you were supposed to obey your husband. And this was reinforced by Dr. Spock, who was seen as a lead doctor at the time. what happened there with it disappearing. Who wrote, one of his books for raising children and wives was super popular, and he reinforced that you needed to obey your husband, right, almost like it was the father, and you needed to be the passive role, and that women, he wrote this is in his saying, women who want to work are escaping responsibility. And specifically, it goes on, I'll put the leaving behind an abandoned, deprived, and delinquent, which should sound familiar, right? Child. So again, it's all the mother's problem. That saying should sound familiar with women in the war industry, and that women who were unhappy with being a suburban housewife should seek psychological help, because something, and not in a positive way, because something's wrong with them. Right, you have all of this new gadgets and wealth, more prosperity than your parents had with the Great Depression, and so something's wrong with you. And there were plenty of women who were bored and unhappy with this role and position, especially those who had college degrees and had envisioned at some point that they might have a career or do something else. So yeah, those who were unhappy with this suburban ideal should seek psychological help, and again, not in a positive way of seek, and then of course reinforcing traditional roles. One of the crazy ways of traditional roles was that you actually had architectural designs with, and right, this is just the layout of the house, and they would label boys' room, girls' room, as if it mattered which room was which, but it was so hyper focused on traditional roles in that sense. And so then where we also see it, and I mentioned it with the pleasant, right, is with TV shows, and in magazines, TV shows and magazines. And we're going to look at both of those. One is going to be, that we're going to look at is the, what is it, the Housekeeping Weekly or Monthly. Housekeeping, we'll say monthly or weekly, which was a good wife, right? It's the role of a good wife. And then the other that I wanted to give you an example was Leave It to Beaver. And then we're going to look at one from I Love Lucy. The Leave It to Beaver one, I couldn't find the clip anymore. They had taken it down, but I can give you some of the key aspects with it, right? The wife in Leave It to Beaver has almost no personality. Like, if you watch any of those shows and you're like, okay, what are her key characteristics about her? I don't know that I could describe it. She's so bland, but that bland, right, is pleasant. And that's exactly what they wanted to reinforce. She's there as just to move scenes along. She is always agreeable. She never challenges anything. She is calm, even when like the children are running around screaming or the husband's upset. She always defers to her husband in everything, right? It's like, she doesn't know. And again, that reinforces this idea that women were stupid, that they weren't smart, they didn't know what to do, and that she then was taking care of the household. She was always cleaning and cooking. Like that was her main activities in the show. So this is definitely a super traditional suburban ideal. The other one, I Love Lucy. I want to mention this one when we're going to see clips, because I Love Lucy was a little bit different. Where it was unique, they lived in the city rather than the suburbs. You also have an interracial marriage, which was huge to be showcasing on TV, right? And they were actually married in real life. Lucille Ball was married to Desi Arnaz, and they were married for a while in real life, and they played a married couple on the show. And to have a marriage that wasn't with two white people in the 50s was a huge deal. And then on top of that, Lucy has a ton of personality. All right, so she does challenge Ricky. That it's Desi Arnaz is the actor. It challenges Ricky. Ricky was the name, the character of her husband, right? All the time. But what we're going to see in one of the clips I'll set up for you in just a minute after we look at some of these others is that the comedy comes from challenging traditional roles, going against what her husband tells her to do, and failing. And failing spectacularly, right? And then it's always resolved by restoring to the traditional roles and accepting, at least until the next episode, that that's what should happen. So I'll get into that in a little bit more detail with that, but it's even I Love Lucy still reinforces it. So first thing I wanted to look at was the Good Wife's Guide. Right, so this is the one I put up for you to look at as well. Here is the list, and this is true. This is not made up. This was in a magazine that was promoted for what women should do to be the ideal wife. Have dinner ready, plan ahead, even the night before, to have a delicious meal ready on time for his return. This is a way of letting him know that you have been thinking about him and are concerned about his needs. Most men are hungry when they get home, and the prospect of a good meal is part of the warm welcome needed, right? So you need to be ready to go. It's the honey, I'm home. And honey, I'm home, and where's dinner? The next one, prepare yourself. Take 15 minutes to rest so you'll be refreshed when he arrives. Touch up your makeup, put a ribbon on, and be fresh looking. He has just been with a lot of work-weary people. So again, this looks. Remember we mentioned all of these ones about looks. You need to, whatever you've been doing, watching the kids, doing the housework, you need to dress up for when your husband comes home. Be a little gay and a little more interesting for him. So change your character. Change your personality, right? When he comes home, you need to be interesting. His boring day may need a lift, and one of your duties is to provide it. Clear away the clutter. Make one last trip through the main part of the house just before your husband arrives. Run a dust cloth over the tables. During the cooler months of the year, you should prepare and light a fire for him to unwind by. Your husband will feel he has reached a haven of rest and order. Oh, that should sound familiar to the cult of domesticity that we talked about. Remember, home is the haven in the heartless world. That language is from, a throwback to the cult of domesticity. It'll give you a lift too. After all, catering to his comfort will provide you with immense personal satisfaction. So this is here your identity is wrapped around, right, your husband's. And it really was. You don't have your own identity. It's all shaped around husbands, the household, and the children. Minimize all noise. At the time of his arrival, eliminate all noise of washer, dryer, vacuum. Encourage the children to be quiet. Yeah, my children are never quiet. I don't know how you make your kids be quiet. But yes, apparently make sure the children are a nuisance if they're loud when he gets home. Things should be quiet. Be happy to see him. Greet him with a warm smile and show sincerity in your desire to please him. Listen to him. You may have a dozen important things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. Don't greet him with complaints and problems. This is the nagging. And there were There were articles in the women's magazine collection that the full-on said, if you nag your husband too much, he will leave you for a younger, hotter woman who doesn't nag. And so it's not surprising that there's these anxieties with all the coffee things being pushed at these women, saying if you don't please your husband, and if you're a bad housewife, if you make poor coffee, if you don't do this, if you don't look nice, if you don't do this, he's going to leave you or not love you anymore. And it reinforced those anxieties, which is just crazy. Talking about creating complexes for women here. Don't complain if he's late for dinner, or even if he stays out all night. Count this as minor compared to what he might have gone through at work. Make him comfortable. Have him lean back in a comfortable chair or lie down in the bedroom. Have a cool and warm drink ready for him. Arrange his pillow and offer to take off his shoes. Speak in a low, soothing, pleasant voice. Don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is master of the household, and as such will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. A good wife always knows her place. Right? It's just, I would be a horrible 1950s housewife. And I think most people would today. You know, we've been raised, not everyone, but a lot more within society, that to speak your mind, to say what you think, to not put up with this kind of crap. But this is what was reinforced in magazines, in TVs, in advertisements, in books, over and over again. Now, again, I want to be clear. Women challenged this in the 1950s. And the 1950s was not some only conservative, conformative side. You have those that were seen as the rebels, who wore the leather jackets and went against the traditional conformity. You had the beatniks. You had other groups that challenged the status quo. The 50s, just like World War II with women and the war effort and WAC, was a dichotomy between what was being pushed and what many, many women followed or felt obligated to follow, and then also others who rejected that. Nonetheless, the women and men in this case too were bombarded with this message over and over and over again. Okay, so the other one that I wanted to do was just to look at the I Love Lucy one. Now there's two parts to this. This is probably the most iconic of the I Love Lucy. This is job switching. And I'm only showing 2 clips of it, but how it basically starts is they get into the house, and Ricky gets mad at Lucy because she overspent money. And then it says there's women are spenders, men are the earners, and there's another good episode where it shows like when he gets upset, like she'll start acting all passive and like, yes sir, no sir, sorry sir, and he'll get all close right up into her in this kind of implied violence, and then she'll be like, wait, what am I doing, and then talk back to him or go at him and stuff. So that's where I Love Lucy is different, right? But they still showcase that hint at violence, that hint of passivity and submissiveness. But then, so they say, whatever, our household work and being housewives is a hard job. You don't know what we have to do. So again, here, pushing the boundaries and topics and suggesting that they do a lot of work. That is unique about I Love Lucy. And the men are like, yeah, whatever. Well, you couldn't do what we do. We have to go to work all day and work hard. And they're like, yeah, we could. And so they agree to switch roles for a week. They don't take over their husbands' jobs. Instead, it's that the husbands will stay home for a week and do all the housework, and the Lucy and Ethel will go get jobs for a week. And then here's the comedy, right? So they, so again, where it's unique, this with the men failing too, they acknowledge at the end of all of this crazy. Which we're not going to see that clip. This is definitely a awesome episode to watch, just because it's funny anyway, but it has all of these components to it. And at the end, the men acknowledge, we didn't realize how much work you actually do. Bonus, because a lot of the shows in media, that's not suggested or shown at all, right? Women have it easy. They should be enjoying this type of thing, right? But at the same time, they have both the men and women fail horribly. In fact, we'll see with the women when they do during their final job, which is the candy rapping on the factory line. One, they have the female factory foreman act very masculine and tough and strong, but two, it's ridiculous failing. Like, right, it's again this idea that somehow on both sides, as soon as you have to do the incorrect gender role, that you become incompetent and stupid and can't figure any of it out. And I think it's even more obvious for Lucy and Ethel, where they're doing a job that's really simple. Where you're arguing, okay, well, if the men didn't know like how much rice to cook, that's more reasonable. They don't have the internet back in the 50s to look it up, versus wrapping candy, right? But it's also where the comedy in these shows are, because Lucy, right, pushes the boundaries, challenges traditional norms, and then fails like in very comical ways. And part of their comedy is the physical comedy in these shows, which is what makes it funny, but it also is highlighting again every time. If you don't believe me, go watch a bunch of I Love Lucy episodes and see how every time she challenges what either her husband tells her to do or the status quo, the comedy comes in when she fails horribly with it, and then the show resolves when they acknowledge that and go back to the right traditional roles that they're supposed to do. So in the job switching, we're just going to watch when they fail at their jobs, switching jobs. But at the very end of this episode, like I said, the men apologize and say, we didn't realize how hard it was. Can we go back? And this is after one day. And the women are like, oh no, we totally agree. Your jobs are hard too. We couldn't do it. Let's switch. And then they're happy again, because they went back to their traditional roles. All right, so let's look at so we get to see the comical parts of this here. Okay, right, so the physical comedy of them failing horribly as well. Now this is the women, and prior to this scene, they had tried several different positions at the chocolate factory, and they'd failed all of them. So this is their last chance, right? So here's this scene. Okay, so those are the clips with that. Pause. Come on. Enough with that. Go away. Those are the clips that show, again, the idea of that I do want to point out, I Love Lucy does challenge things, but it also reinforced both the husbands and them as wives failed miserably, and then this physical kind of comedy sense in this most almost ridiculous style, and then it's the resolution is them acknowledging that they both failed, but also that each other's jobs were harder than they thought that it was going to be, and then the funny part too is that the husbands bought them chocolate because they didn't know what jobs they went and got as an apology. And they were like, oh, at the end. But then everything is resolved and happy because they go back to their, expected roles. Okay, so that's the media. That's the Suburban Housewife and that ideal. The last thing I want to look at is the challenge that took place to the Suburban Housewife. Specifically with Betty Friedan and the feminine Mystique. This was a book that was written, that became a bestseller, but it really was just addressing a lot of the issues that women already were feeling and maybe felt unsure about talking about. She actually called it the problem with no name, and the idea that every woman knew about that. Every woman knew that the problem, but it had no name because they didn't want to talk about it, or they were afraid to talk about it because afraid to talk about it. And that problem with no name was that they were unhappy. Women were unhappy, depressed even maybe, and unfulfilled. And not just unfulfilled, would be that they unhappy, depressed, and not, we'll say, content with the role of suburban housewife. But right, they were afraid to say something because you had Dr. Spock, you had the TV, you had media bombarding with them that they should be content with these roles and that these were the roles that they were supposed to play. So she said, what is causing this problem? Why are people unfulfilled? And she said, well, the reality is that a lot of the women who are these suburban housewives are college educated women and who once wanted a career. And now they're stuck at home, being told that they should find happiness and fulfillment in cleaning the house and being submissive to their husbands. And that this was a massive problem. It was creating problems for women in a variety of ways. And so one was that women were having nervous breakdowns because they never felt like they measured up, right? Think of the example, the coffee ads. These women were having like breakdowns because they were serving bad coffee. But in real life, they were having nervous breakdowns. She said one woman couldn't breastfeed her baby because of milk production, and she and that this led her to suicidal feelings because she felt like that she had failed as a mother. And then this isn't something that still is sometimes happens today, but there was even more pressure back then to to not be able to breastfeed your baby, that you weren't fulfilling your role as a mother and what you were supposed to do. And so to the point that she almost was, not only were women having nervous breakdowns, but she felt suicidal. She said another woman, and she gave an example, was dying of cancer because she refused to take the drugs she needed, and I think chemotherapy too. So she refused to take drugs and chemo because of the what she called unfeminine, not Betty Friedan, but the woman, unfeminine side effects, i.e. like losing your hair and stuff like that. So that she's choosing to die rather than try to save her life because it made her look unfeminine, because there was so much pressure on, pressure for looks and behavior, right? The submissive, passive, pleasant and passive, that women were losing any identity. So this was creating a loss of identity of self. And that for looks, right, women were, like I said, having nervous breakdowns, suicidal thoughts, and even willingness to die. Right, to look good. Because that they were told that was their responsibility and their role, and you better do so, your husband might not love you. I mean, imagine thinking that, like, I can't get chemo or I can't take these drugs because if I lose my hair, my husband won't love me anymore because I can't look pretty, or I'm not going to have the energy to clean the house before he gets home or serve him dinner. And so this loss of identity and self, right, was then essentially creating especially said, even with women who didn't have college degrees, but especially women who did, because they had an identity and idea of what they wanted to be that didn't involve being a housewife and having this domestic goals, and then all of a sudden to have it shift so thoroughly. But she argued that even women who didn't go to college were still feeling this way as well, if they had other goals or envisioned themselves doing anything else but this whole full-fledged centered focus on domestic ideals and submissiveness to their husbands. And so the loss of identity was creating a whole generation of women who were depressed and unhappy with their lives. And that this was, she tried to say this was a common problem. We need to stop, beating around the bushes and need to name it and talk about it. And it's okay for women to talk about it. And that, basically she was saying like, hey, don't listen to Dr. Spock at all in that. And then you actually had, this became a #1 bestseller, and it wasn't just women buying it. And so that is, I think, important to acknowledge, that you had husbands also buying this for their wives. So there were some husbands that were acknowledging, I mean, plenty of women bought this themselves as well. But there was stuff talking about how husbands were buying this for their wives, and so that suggested there was some acknowledgement that women were, or that the husbands were recognizing that their wives were not happy, and they wanted them to be. And then women and work. Oh, and the last thing with this, right, is that this reaction and response to this massive push for that does help lead to women's rights movement that ends up kind of piggybacking off of the civil rights movement. So you have the civil rights movement, and then you have the women's rights movement that also takes place, and a push for equality that leads you into the late 60s and early 70s, where you have a massive shift in feminism and the idea and equality, right? And that certainly, Betty Friedan is not the only thing, but it was definitely, I think all this was being shoved onto women who were ultimately unhappy with it. So then women in work during this period, as I mentioned, right, it wasn't all just the suburban housewife. Working women continued to increase. There were more women working than before World War II. So not everyone stopped working after the war. They may not have been working in the factory jobs anymore, but women, there were plenty of women who wanted to continue working, and it became more acceptable for married women and women with children to work, because those had definitely been things that had not been acceptable. One of the things that comes out of this is part-time work, which you could argue, good or bad. For some it was good. It certainly has created some other problems, but the part-time jobs was now accepted because there were women who were wanting to work but had kids. You also women were having kids young. So you have a push for women to get married at younger and having kids younger, because then they could go back to work once the kids were at school. So then it was almost like, well, women will raise the kids when they're younger and not in school, but once they go to school, they'll be able to, they could go work, and that was acceptable. And so, yes, the lower classes, women had always worked. It was a necessity. But there was this sense that in the middle class and upper class, but especially the middle class, that it was a sign of wealth and the husband doing a good job, providing for the family, which was his role and duty in the house, if the wife didn't have to work, right? So that was an important aspect of it. And so this did mean that women had to defend their desire to work in the middle class, right? And that it was yes, it was not a need, but a personal desire or aspiration, and that was okay. And this was seen as, before, the justification had always come that it was, if there was a need, then it was understood, right? Because ultimately in society, the husband's career came first. And this was promoted. There was an article called "How to Help Your Husband Get Ahead." Right, and this whole article suggested support him, right, in what he's doing. Be nice to his boss. So don't antagonize his boss or be mean. Be pleasant, of course, was always in there. Learn his interest. Don't have your own interest. Learn his. Certainly don't nag, right, or complain. In fact, they argued that you should take up classes to learn his interest. And then it said, be willing to give up your career or hobbies for him to get ahead. Right? So you have this even as it's becoming more acceptable, you have these mixed signals on women and work. Because ultimately the idea was that the husband's career was supposed to come first. You did have negative pushback, just like with the war on working mothers, and they had to defend themselves, as well as the idea that you had to defend yourself against the fact that your primary goal should not be working yourself, but supporting your husband. And the key with this is, right, that there were plenty of women who did fight for this in order to be able to work. And then one of the big things that came out of this, though, with that was that there became a clear gender classification in jobs as more and more women began to work. And we talked about this briefly with like the pilots and stuff. Is that you get what actually became called pink jobs, is what they get called, in that they are dominated by women, and men move out of those positions. So, right, you can think of like secretary, phone operator, things like that where this was things that they could still sometimes connect to the domestic sphere. Nonetheless, women were working more and were improving conditions. And the other thing that goes with this is that college education continued to rise for women. And the more that college education and degrees rose out of this, right, then you're going to have an increase in jobs and careers available for women. This also, because as more and more women graduated from college, this definitely paved the way for the women's rights movement. Right, just like Betty Friedan's book, so did the increase in college educated women coming out of this in the late 1960s with the women's rights movement that was attached to the civil rights movement. The role of feminism was definitely talked about in college and push for change. That, you know, specifically this idea of fighting against the media. And this was all happening during the 1950s and through the 1960s, right? And then, of course, as the Cold War fears begin to die down, then that's going to alleviate some of that push for this traditional nuclear family, and role and gender roles, right? The whole, this begins, we'll say slowly ends the 1950s push for gender roles, nuclear family, and conformity. And that's certainly going to help with changes as well, right? The fear of stepping out of bounds and social shunning that could take place, the idea that you might be subversive, that begins to go away. So this is massive changes for women in the 1950s. Not only a regression in many things of what we saw, from the 1920s or World War II and where women progressed, but then also that there was many women pushing back against these super, super strong influences. And that's what I hope that it was shown here with this, is just how strong women were inundated, and men, by media to promote this ideal. And that if you are, you're raised on this and bombarded with this day in and day out, that it's definitely going to be something that people begin to embody about themselves or their wives or their daughters as part of women's identity. And so to fight back against that and push against those traditional roles is definitely a big thing, with just the amount of pressure that was put because of the fear of the Cold War and the idea that you needed to conform. And so the idea that if women were pushing against this, then they could potentially be subversive to the American way. But also just that pushing against those social norms when everyone's saying this is what you're supposed to do. Are you for communism? Are you against the United States, right? Or just you're not a real woman if you're not doing these things. And that there were women who challenged those roles, and it began to acknowledge that they were unhappy with that and wanted change. All right, so that's where we're going to end with looking at women in the suburban housewife and the suburban ideal.